Today in the Climate Optimist we have a guest Jens and myself have very long looked forward to talk to. That's Christiana Figueres. She's from Costa Rica. She took the power as the executive secretary of the UN Climate after the total fiasco in Copenhagen and led the global climate work with Laurent Fabius of France and others to the immense success in Paris. Because we are eager to hear how she made that miracle happen. After working for the UN Climate, she has been working with Global Optimists, and she's now also releasing a book which called The World We Choose. Christiana, we very much look forward to talk to you. And maybe we can start with the very beginning. You are from a political family in Costa Rica. You are from one of the most beautiful nature-near nations in the world. How did it start? How did you get this enthusiasm and engagement for nature and climate?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Erik, and thank you, Jens, for the invitation to join you today. I'm delighted that your video cast or podcast is called Climate Optimist. Our podcast is called Outrage and Optimism because we believe we need both of those. But ultimately, it is the optimism that pulls us forward. So congratulations on your podcast. So where did this start? Let me make a very brief summary. Yes, I was born into a highly political family. My father was 3 times president of Costa Rica. And one of the things, of the many things that he did as a legacy for this wonderful country is to outlaw the army and take the budget, the military budget, and divide it into the Ministry of Education, which is why we have such a high educational level, and into protection of nature. So that legacy that he gave us many, many decades ago in last century has actually paid off very well. And we have a peace dividend because of the lack of militarization. We have an education dividend, and we have a biodiversity dividend. We treasure all 3 of them. And those who are part of my generation, the second generation after that of my father, were already born into this, I would say, very blessed political context in a country that is truly devoted to all 3: peace, education, and biodiversity conservation. So it is no surprise that from the time I was very young, I was taught the value of those 3 principles that my father was very adamant about, and that nature was always very much a part of our daily life. And I have my father to thank for that. I also have to thank him because he did teach us that we have the obligation as parents to turn over whatever we have inherited in a better state, not in a worse state. And when I realized that my generation was turning over to the next generation a planet that was severely diminished in its biodiversity, in its atmospheric stability, and frankly, in its economic stability, in the health of both humans and the planet, that's when I turned my attention to climate change way back in the 90s. And I got involved in climate change, and before I knew it, the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon asked me to take over the negotiations in 2010 after, as you have mentioned, the collapse of the negotiations in Copenhagen. It was, of course, quite a task, quite a challenge, because I found first a team of fantastic people working for the United Nations Climate Change Convention, 500 person strong team, but highly demoralized. Basically, morale was in the trash can because they had worked for years for what was expected to be a Copenhagen agreement, and then never came through. So my first priority was to work with my colleagues in the convention secretariat to change the mental paradigm from one of disaster and of failure to one of potential success. And we moved very slowly over several years from a mentality of impossible to a mentality of, maybe it is possible, then to probable, then to likely, and finally, just before the Paris Agreement, to the unstoppable, and then to the delivered. So that was a journey, a mental shift journey that the Secretariat took, and that frankly we invited all government representatives to come on the same mental paradigm shift with us throughout those 5 years. The result of that mental paradigm shift, in addition to a lot of work on the political side, on the technical side, with stakeholders, with procedural improvements, obviously everything else helped. But on the basis of a mental paradigm shift from impossible and failure to possible and delivered success.
Let's stop for a moment with Copenhagen, because that was in a way the low point of the entire climate process. Without blaming anyone, what went wrong in Copenhagen? To me, at least one factor was that we were still living in a totally Western-dominated world, where the idea was that Europe and North America could decide, and not really bringing China, India, but many other developing countries into the process. But you made a new, different process possible. What was your thinking after Copenhagen?
Well, I'm afraid that there was a study done of Copenhagen to answer exactly your question, what went wrong in Copenhagen. That study is 300 pages long. So there were many, many factors that went wrong in Copenhagen. But once you have made such a dramatic failure, then the study of the factors that led to the failure actually becomes a very important lesson. So I think of Copenhagen as the most successful failure of the United Nations because we learned an awful lot. So from procedural mistakes that we made, you don't, in the middle of the winter in Copenhagen, you don't leave political representatives of their countries out in the freezing cold and snow for hours before they are being able to be registered and come in. That, just starting with that detail of how representatives or how all participants are registered, that already gives you a sense of how much we had to learn. And so we went from 6 or 7 hour wait for registration to 2-minute registration by the time we got to Paris. But we also had, frankly, technology working with us, Erik. So, in Copenhagen, from Copenhagen to Paris, just in those 5 years, the price of renewable energy dropped significantly and dramatically. The price of solar, the price of wind, really, really dropped. And those are the solutions of technology. If those are the solutions to climate change. If they had not dropped in price, we would not have been able to gravitate toward those technological solutions as quickly and as easily as we did in Paris in 2015. We also had a dramatic shift in the geopolitics. We had, at the beginning, we had the first term of President Obama, in which he was focused mostly on domestic issues, the health issue in the United States being the first one that truly took his attention. And in the first term, he did not feel that he had the political flexibility to devote as much of his political capital to an international agenda such as climate change. But by Copenhagen, we had, by Paris, we had him in his second term with much more political flexibility and with a determination, as you have mentioned, to reach out quite actively, quite sincerely to China, to India, to many other developing countries. And I could go on with so many other factors. Well, let me just add one more to that list, and that was the deliberate convening that we made of stakeholders who are not government representatives. We deliberately went out to companies, to the science world, to the spiritual world, to associations of business, but also of grandmothers, of doctors, of nurses, of indigenous people. We brought all stakeholders to the table, not because they can negotiate the text, because that is only for national governments, but because they also have a stake. And that made for a much more complex process with many more different points of view, but one that was much more firmly grounded in a consensus, a broad social consensus that was carefully woven together throughout those 5 years.
Other factors are critical to success of climate talks, as you mentioned. The price of solar energy, which has fallen by 90% over the last decade, is a critical issue, and the political economy is maybe now the main driver of the climate conversation in the world. But if you look into this world of climate talks, true, there was bad, and we were freezing to death in Copenhagen, and the hall where the talks were held was one of the worst picked by any nation anywhere. Hard to say that, since this is our sisters and brothers here up north. So it was not the most cozy environment you could get in Denmark. All that is true. But of course, it's mainly about what you're making the scope of the process wider. You say bringing in spiritual leaders, and much wider when it comes to geography and bringing in the key actors. But after Copenhagen, when you started putting your eyes on Paris, there were many talks between in Cancun and Durban and many others. But how did you build up the critical mass for a success in Paris? And who were your key partners? And were there any and what were the difficulties you faced?
Well, as you say, it was a slow, detailed process. First of all, Erik, of much listening. I traveled to almost every country of the world, and I never came with statements. I always came with a long list of questions, because I really wanted to understand what was the long-term interest and need of every country that was participating in these negotiations. So it was my responsibility, and honestly my pleasure and my honor, to really understand what was behind the positions, the negotiating positions that were constantly being put on the table on the part of countries. And once you get behind the positions to the long-term interest, and once you bring the attention of those government representatives to not just the short-term, but the long-term implications of what we're talking about, then it is quite fascinating to see how what are today understood to be differences in the short term, in the long term, they tend toward convergence. They don't overlap immediately or perfectly, but they tend toward a certain convergence. And so it was the process of identifying where is the space of that convergence occurring, and then very carefully strengthening that convergence, fertilizing that soil until everyone felt that they had a root in that space of convergence. And it is within that political space of convergence that then you begin to develop the legal text to express that political space of convergence. So there is, of course, a lot of political work to be done. There's a lot of legal work to be done, because all of this needs to be expressed in a legally binding text that was developed by the government representatives throughout several years, refined constantly at every single one of our meetings, of which we had sometimes 5 in 1 year, although the public was always more attentive to the last one that we have, the annual COP, it's called, Conference of the Parties. But in preparation for that, we had sometimes, certainly 4, sometimes even 5 meetings that were preparing that legal text, word by word, comma by comma.
And of course, you were the key driver of this process, but you had important partners. From my perspective, one of them was Fabius, the then Foreign Minister of France, and French leadership with UN Climate Convention was, as I could see it, absolutely critical. I mean, you worked hand in hand, but the UN cannot drive it alone, so France was critical. And then, of course, you had the famous meeting between President Xi and President Obama, which was also kind of background music for Paris. So take us into these wider developments.
Well, that is absolutely true, and the French government, starting with Minister Fabius, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, did an absolutely brilliant job of bringing together the last details of that political space that was there. He stood, of course, on the shoulders of all of the other presidents of the COP that we had had before. And all of the previous work, which is exactly the way it should be done. You don't go from the trash can of politics to the pinnacle of success overnight, and certainly not alone. This was a process to which many, many governments contributed, and certainly all the presidencies along the way. But by the time we got to the French presidency, there was a lot of work done, but much work that still needed to be done. And I must say, I have seldom worked with anyone who had such a refined political acumen as Minister Fabius. It was such a pleasure to work with him. So gratifying to see his sensitivity, not only to the needs and interests of industrialized countries, but also to developing countries, and his immediate understanding of the points of view and the points on the text that came from developing countries, and also his capacity to find balance there, especially between the global north and the global south. So it was a pleasure to work with President Fabius during that last year.
You are really famous for your outburst when you first started your job in your first press conference in Bonn. You were asked, when did you think there would be real action on climate? And you said, not in my lifetime. You must be very pleasantly surprised at what has actually happened. Paris is a success. Now the next challenge is Glasgow, where hopes are high, because this time we have half of the world GNP is committed to zero emissions by 2050. What do you think we would get out of Glasgow? What are the challenges? And what do you think we can get out of there, notably for participation on the southern countries?
Well, yes, I just want to go back to that, not in my lifetime, because it was such a turning point for me. I heard myself saying that at my first press conference. And, you know, before I walked out of that room, I had realized that what I had uttered was the gloom and the despair that so many of us who call ourselves Copenhagen survivors were feeling at that moment because of the huge catastrophe in Copenhagen. But by the time I walked out of the press room, I knew that we had to totally change that attitude as I have described, and go from the impossible, which is never in my lifetime, to the delivered success. So I'm very grateful, and I'm still actually hunting for that journalist who asked me that incredible question, because it was the turning point for me from pessimism to optimism, and I'm truly grateful for that question. Yes, to the second part of your statement, yes, Glasgow is the next step of the way. Let's remember that the national governments meet every year. They also meet in between, but they meet every year at the end of the year, except if we're in COVID. They meet every year to continue their conversations moving forward. What is interesting to understand about Glasgow is that it is not an international multilateral negotiation process per se. The Paris Agreement is actually a multilateral framework that was developed and written to be not static, but rather very much accompany the transition and the transformation of the global economy over the next few decades, at least until 2050. And that negotiated framework that was adopted unanimously, although the United States then took a little detour and came back, but that was a unanimous decision of all countries of the world. That is the legal framework that continues to accompany us. So there are some details, important details, by the way, that still need to be negotiated, but the framework agreement is there. So what comes to the fore in Glasgow is no longer negotiation of a legal text, but rather the first very important step of the implementation of that negotiated text and those commitments that were made. Because being the 5th anniversary, we have to play with the math there because Glasgow should have happened last year, but this will be the 5th time after 2015 that governments meet to take a look at what they have done with respect to what they registered in the first tranche of the Paris Agreement, which were the commitments that they registered in 2015. So now, 5 years later, and they need to review where they are with respect to what they said they were going to do in 2015 and increase their ambition. This is an always increasing ambition process that is embedded in the Paris Agreement, and what all countries have committed to is every 5 years to review what they have done and increase their ambition for the next 5 years or for the next 10 years until we get to global net zero by 2050. That is why Glasgow is important, because it is the first time that together we're going to measure our capacity to implement the Paris Agreement at the scale and scope that was envisioned, and at the same time to register the second tranche of commitments and of ambitions that governments will register this year in Glasgow. They will then do the same process 5 years from now, and then 10 and 15 and so on. So this is the first time that what we call the ratchet process is actually being tested. And it is a very important part of the Paris Agreement, because we know that before the Paris Agreement, the world's increase in temperature was headed for anywhere between 4 to 6 degrees temperature increase. Well, that is a catastrophe for humans and for nature. With the Paris Agreement, with the first tranche of commitments that were made there, that temperature increase came down to 3.7, much better than 4 to 6. Today, we know that with everything that is being done, we are currently headed to 2.3 degrees, much better than 3.7. And the best testament that the Paris Agreement is alive and well, and that it is having its effect, because the point of the Paris Agreement is to increasingly lower the temperature increase that is projected. So 2.3 is much better than 4 to 6, much better than 3.7, but it is still not enough. Science has told us 3 years after the Paris Agreement, at the end of 2018, science gave us exceeding granularity of understanding into the fact that we cannot allow the temperature to increase beyond 1.5 degrees. So we still have a gap there. We're currently headed for 2.3, better than where we were before, but that is why it is important that in Glasgow, countries come with an even increased ambition, because we have to continue to shave off those extra, that extra heat until we're on course for 1.5.
Quote that I rather like, from the impossible to the unstoppable. I like to think that applies to the attitude of business. You talked about Paris, the NGOs were in business at the time were skeptical. In just the last year, I think there's been an enormous change in the attitude of business. The exception being American oil company, but otherwise, business has really changed. The entire investment industry now supports climate change, and they realize the risk that they have from it. And business now realizes that the most dangerous thing to do, most risky, is to do nothing. What is your view on the contribution business now can have to keeping the warming to a 2.3?
Well, you know, Jens, I am fully convinced that the Paris Agreement would not have happened and would not have been able to be adopted by the governments if business hadn't helped. I was very, very intent on reaching out to business. And where I agree with you is that in 2015, it was not the norm for businesses to be on board and to understand that their business continuity was at risk. But we had many leading, forward-thinking CEOs who did understand that and were incredibly helpful in steps as important as calling, literally on the phone, calling political leaders in the countries that they operated to say, look, from our perspective, we need to address climate change. And if you do not help to move this, our operation in your country is going to have severe, severe threats to our operation here. So I am truly grateful for those early corporate leaders who really understood the risk that they were engaging in should countries not adopt an ambitious agreement. And I'm grateful to them because they very much contributed to the success. And today I'm very grateful to them because they have continued their work. They have continued to speak to their peers, to broaden the tent. And as you say, the major shift between 5 years ago and now is not just corporate culture and thinking, but the financial sector. They have truly understood that their assets are under threat if they do not protect them from the ravages of climate change. So I don't want to sit here and say, either corporate or the financial sector are out there philanthropically wanting to, save the planet. That is not the point. It would be problematic if they were. Fortunately, from a private sector perspective, from a financial securities perspective, these leaders have understood that this is in their enlightened self-interest. And that if they want business continuity, if they want growth in their investments, if we want to secure the capital markets and have further prosperity, then it has to be hand in hand with well-being for everyone, for all humans, and also for all living beings on this planet. That is the major mental shift that has occurred over the last 5 years. From Copenhagen to Paris, the shift was, as you said, from the impossible to the unstoppable in our mental shift, that yes, we can come together to agree to this framework. Over the last 5 or 6 years, the mental shift has been from viewing climate change as a threat and a huge cost to understanding that addressing climate change is actually a huge opportunity. It is a business opportunity, it is a health opportunity, it is a stability opportunity, and therefore it is a responsibility that we all have. But from a much more positive point of view, not from a threat and cost point of view.
Isn't this the main change from Copenhagen to Paris and to now, that until very recently, business and governments saw climate action as a cost, a big cost or a small cost. You and I would argue that, the cost of inaction is much bigger, so we need to act. While now, business generally see it as an opportunity for growth, for creating jobs, for having profits. So it's not a cost, it's an enormous business opportunity. And maybe the biggest shift there is Biden, because at Obama, not to speak about Trump, because still climate was a cost. Biden has set it out to the American people as an enormous opportunity for economic development and jobs in America. That's to me maybe a main reason for optimism.
Yes, absolutely. That is definitely, let's say, chapter 2 of the shift. Well, the first one was Copenhagen to Paris. And now if we just want to use the reference of cities, Paris to Glasgow, that is the shift that we're seeing. And it's high time, Erik, it's high time. Because we have to remember, before we stand up and clap and, stand in ovation with the delight of that shift, let's just put it into context. We have been delaying action on climate change for decades. And so we are standing at the edge of a precipice. Science has told us abundantly clearly that we only have until the end of this decade in order to shift the direction of emissions. We have to, by the end of this decade, we have to get global emissions to be at 50% where they are right now. So instead of increasing the trajectory of increase of emissions, which we've had in the past few years, we have to actually bend the curve. We've been going up. We have to bend the curve and begin our descent of emissions until by 2030, we get to 50% of where we are now. And by 2050, we have to be at net zero. That is the only trajectory that is a responsible, safe trajectory for human presence, for human health, for human well-being, for economic profitability, and for stability on this planet. It's the only pathway. There is no other one. So here we are. Over the next 9 years, we have to reduce emissions by 1/2. Is it possible? I'm hearing more and more from companies that, yes, that they are capable of doing this. They are pulling forward. Many companies have already, thousands of companies have already come forward on the road to zero commitment, which is to be at net zero by 2050. A sizable number of those companies have actually pulled that forward under something that is called the Climate Pledge. Those companies have pulled that date forward and said, we're going to be at net zero by 2040. Then you have a subsector of companies that has said even 2040 is too late. We're going to do it by 2030. And then, of course, you have the handful of truly, truly forward-leaning companies that have said, well, being climate neutral or zero net is not enough. We actually have to be climate positive, which means we will absorb more emissions than we are emitting. So you already have a handful of companies that have committed to being climate positive over the next few years. That is the trend, and I expect that trend to accelerate over the next few years. My only question is, will we make it by 2030? I am willing to bet that we will look back at 2020 and say that was the year that we changed the trajectory. Instead of a trajectory that was on the increase, in 2020 was the first year that we started to see a trajectory of decrease. Obviously, not a straight decrease, because nothing happens like that. There's no smooth line like that on any graph. We will definitely have peaks and valleys, but the tendency, the trajectory of emissions will be on the descent. I'm actually pretty willing to bet on that one. Where I honestly do not know is, will we make it to half emissions by 2030? That is the challenge that science presents us with.
Lenin once said that there are decades where nothing is happening, and then there are years where decades are happening. And you think we may look back to 2020 exactly as that, the year where decades were happening when it comes to the real green shift in the world?
Let's hope that that's true.
Thank you so much, Christiana. It's been a pleasure talking to you. It's always inspiring also to see the developments in Costa Rica, which is such a world leader on greening the land and on renewable energies, and to hear your story about how you turned around the global conversation on climate from the fiasco in Copenhagen into the success in Paris, which will lead us to even greater successes in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both of you very much.